next steps. Okay. All right. So let's get into the introduction here. Hey, introduction, just real quick. Some definitions here for you. You're going to hear me say these things. Adversary means the bad guy. Asset, for the most part, there's 5 classifications or categories for assets. In this case, what we're talking about is humans or people. And so the asset that we're worried about here, it's something that has a positive value to it. The asset that we're talking about here, which is a critical asset, which you see like two terms down there, is something that has a positive value, like an asset with us, where some sort of compromise creates an undesirable risk. And what that means is we can't allow this asset to be harmed or compromised. And so basic assets, 5 classifications or categories, anything that has a positive value. We break those down into people. It can be buildings or facilities. It can be expensive equipment. It can be information. It can be some sort of a process. And when we talk about critical asset, those things where if they're compromised, it creates this unacceptable risk. That's going to be people. Okay. Consequence just means in risk, it's the impact that this event has on the church. Delay is just the slowing down of adversary progress. And what that means is that can be physically or psychologically. We want to try to do that psychologically. Okay. Design basis threat is just a government term for what are you trying to protect your church against? So we're going to get into threat classification or threat analysis. I'll get into how we classify threats and what that looks like, especially if you guys are trying to develop a physical security plan. Okay. We'll get into, later on as we get into DBT, I'm going to talk about the different types of adversaries. So there's insiders, outsiders, and I'll tell you the difference between the two. Detection is just our ability to see something early, like see adversary activity early. And that is the key to success. So seeing something early. Deterrence is my ability to psychologically impact the motivation of this bad guy. Now, that is not, we'll get into it. That's not done with guns. That's actually done with observation and reporting and your engagement with someone early in this process, which we'll get into. Now, the problem with deterrence is we can't measure deterrence. And what that means is if I were to go into a risk assessment, or let's say I was getting into performance testing, I can measure delay, I can measure detection, I can even measure response based on how fast somebody got there, were they able to neutralize the threat. I really can't measure deterrence unless we capture the bad guy and get them to tell us why they did or did not attack. LEO just is it's an acronym for law enforcement organization. Predatory violence is what we're going to talk about tonight. That is premeditated and planned violence. And there's a very specific purpose behind it. And that purpose is just to destroy, maim, kill, as many buildings, property, or people as possible. Response is what occurs or those actions that are necessary to neutralize the adversary. And when we start talking about attack execution, we don't want to have to get into response because it's dangerous, it may not work. There are legal repercussions behind it. And there's a bunch of stuff with response, especially in this environment, that there's just a lot of risk for us. And we want to try to stay away from that as possible. And then threat and tonight we're going to talk about threat is the intent and capability of an adversary. Now, in other terms, like physical security assessment terms, that could also mean any kind of indication, circumstance, or event that's going to cause some sort of harm to the asset we're trying to protect. But today we're going to be talking about intent and capability. And then a vulnerability is just a system weakness. Normally it's something we're not doing. A lot of times we don't know we're not doing it. Okay. All right. So what is this and what does it mean? And now I'm going to say some things here later on in the presentation. And by no means is it a jab against anybody or a knock. Hey, in church security, the majority of churches around this country, and I do this all over the country, I talk to churches all over the country or ministries all over the country, whether it's on Zoom or whether it is like in person, I'm going and doing training or doing some sort of assessment for them. The majority of church security teams or ministries, depending on how you run this function, one, it's usually manned or it's staffed by volunteers, which means they're not even there part-time. They're there 2 hours a week. They're there 4 hours a week. Sometimes those volunteers are doing other things, like they're volunteering for their ministries. They're married. Some of them have small kids. Some of them work 2 jobs and they're doing this in addition to. So that, in addition to, there's really not a standard in most states for church security teams or ministries. And what I mean by standard is, what do you have to do to actually stand post? In most places, it's nothing. And so when we take those two factors and we look at those, and then of course we start to look at what we're doing, there's a challenge there. And I'm not blaming anybody. It's just that people volunteer. A lot of churches don't have the resources, the ability to put together a very comprehensive or standard plan. And so because of that, there are just system weaknesses or vulnerabilities. And so, and that's just the way it is. There's the majority of churches that I see and that I talk to or do work for, they're either getting started or they have already started something. They're able to do a little bit at a time. You go in, you do something, and by the time I go back the next year, because it's a repeat customer, they've lost 30% of the volunteers they had. And so there's a lot of challenges when we start talking about volunteer or church or house of worship security. So not anybody's fault. It is just it's just the nature of what it is that we're talking about. Okay. So as we get into this, just some things for you guys to understand. I'm not blaming anybody here or trying to shame anybody. It's just what it is volunteers. Okay. So behavior threat detection is it's a preventative measure. And that preventative measure is designed to, when we implement it, to detect predatory violence early in this stage, which we're going to talk about later on. And normally we do that through a number of ways. One is implementing some physical security design features, which we'll get into. It is the use of observation and reporting. So when you see this thing, this potential behavior early, it is reported, it is documented, and maybe we can act on it. The big piece is understanding your operational environment. And what that means is what is supposed to happen and what's not. And there's a couple problems with that. Number one, in the West, we're not very good at it. We're not very good at understanding our pattern here, because we are very responsive in the US. Other countries and locations are pretty good at this. And so, but we are not. And then of course, number two, we have to get away, which we're going to get into, our sin. We live in a fallen world, and while we're in this flesh, we still have indwelling sin, even as believers. And so we have blinders on, or really what we have is we have shades on that are a specific color, and they blind us to what's actually happening. And that is a result of the fall. We won't see clearly until we go into glory. Adam and Eve were much smarter than us. And so when they fell and that sin was imputed upon us, then we are born into this fallen nature, this sinful nature. And even as believers, and if you don't believe me, we'll talk about it later on. You go read it yourself. You can see how Paul talks about that and addresses that in Romans 7. And so even though we are saved and we are believers, and God shows us grace and mercy, there is still this indwelling sin inside of us, and it forces blinders, or actually they're kind of shades of like sunglasses or glasses, and we can't see things clearly. And we see things, or we actually observe things based on us, not really on what's happening. So these are all issues that, even in behavior threat detection, are a problem. And we'll get into that later on, why validation is so important for what we're looking at. Now, this can be used, and now mostly we use this with volunteer security teams. If you're using a contract security organization and you have this in place, maybe they get the training, maybe they don't. There's a lot of factors involved with that. If you're paying a company to do this, or to have people on post for you because they're working for somebody else. And then, of course, this is a tough sell. If you've got law enforcement officers, most of the time, they're not going to do this. Their actual detection is based off of, really, it's based off, it's more profiling than it is a preventative measure or behavior threat detection. They base things off of, there's very specific things or very specific ways that law enforcement officers look at people and try to actually stop crime. And it's different than this. And I say that as a 12-year police officer a long time ago. In fact, I'm actually, came from a big department. And even though I was only there 12 years, I'm actually retired from there, got a pension from there. So I say all those things not to knock the police, but just to say that They just look at things differently. So it's tough to get the police to buy into this or actually come to this training. So early detection of predatory violence is the key for behavior threat detection. Okay. So here's what we're not going to be talking about tonight. Now, here's the good thing about behavior threat detection. There's some value add in behavior threat detection, especially the way that we set up. You can detect and you can also deter other types of violence, very specifically crime. That's not the goal. The goal is to stop something 2 weeks before it happens, very specifically the predatory violence. But if you implement a program like this, you will detect and you probably will deter crime. It will happen. I know because we've done it. Not intentionally. We didn't even know what we were doing. We went to engage with specific individuals, and they left because they didn't want us to go up and start to talk to them. And later on, and I'll talk about it later in a case study. Later on, we found out that they were there, casing the area to try to break into cars because it's an affluent church. And so you get some value add. But tonight, here is what we're not talking about. Okay, we are talking about active assailants. But here's what we're not talking about. We're not talking about other crime-related events like residential or domestic disputes, which means, a husband and wife are fighting. Okay, they pull up. They have nothing to do with the church. They're in their vehicle. They pull up on church property, and then they start a domestic, and one of them stabs the other one. That really has nothing to do with us. So that's not predatory against the church. That's like a bleed over crime. Somebody just showed up and then there was something on scene or on the site. It's not a shooting in relation to another crime or some sort of a crossfire as a byproduct. So what that means is, let's say that, two gangsters are driving down the street chasing, one's chasing the other because one ripped the other off. They stop in front of the church. One of them pulls out a pistol and starts shooting at the other one. And one of those projectiles launches from that weapon into the church parking lot, and it hits a congregant in the leg. We're not talking about that because that is not predatory violence. It's an act of crime. Somebody was injured, but that wasn't predatory. That criminal had no intention of doing anything at the church. It's just their negligent use of firearms and somebody's bad luck, if that makes sense. Okay. And we're not talking about property or personal crimes like resource-driven crimes. It will stop those or it will deter those, and you can detect that, but that's not the purpose of this, and that's not what we're going to talk about tonight, especially as we get into the statistics of predatory violence. Okay, so we are very specifically tonight talking about what most people would call an active shooter or like an active assailant. Okay, and the government definition, that person that plans, premeditates, they come on site, they're there to commit some sort of act of mass violence, and they're armed with some sort of firearm, an edge weapon, explosive devices, or some sort of a vehicle, or anything or any kind of method that could cause some sort of mass amount of injuries. That's an active assailant. So that's what we're talking about tonight. Okay, so let's get into the biblical approach to this threat detection process. Okay, all right. So just some misconceptions, I would say. Okay, number one, there is no such thing as a random attack. Any attack that we see it doesn't have to be a church, it can be any target. Human beings don't just randomly attack when you start talking about predatory violence. Okay, so there's nothing random. No one's going to drive down the road and not know anything about your house of worship or your church, look over within 5 seconds and say, you know what, I think I'm going to drive in here and attack that place and try to kill as many people as possible. It's not random. Predatory violence is premeditated and it is planned, and it goes back to our very beginning in Genesis 3:15. Okay. That there is a high likelihood of active assailants attacks at houses of worship. That's not true. That is statistically not true. Every year an FBI report comes out, the Department of Justice puts it out, and actually probably 94% of the information in that report's factual. It's actually really good data. I've been using that data for about 5 years, and they put out a report every year. And in that report, it breaks down 7 specific targets because they've classified active shooter or active assailant targets into these 7 classifications. Houses of worship is one of those targets. And every year, on average, out of all the active assailant events that take place, houses of worship are less than 4% of the makeup of the targets and the victims of active assailant events. On the average, we'll get 2 a year. There have been a couple years where there were no active assailant events at a church. Now, this year, it's been a pretty busy year already. Coming toward the end of the year, we've had a busy year with people targeting houses of worship, more than last year and the year before. But since 2000, we've had less than 25. It's 350,000 Protestant churches in the United States of America. I have no idea how many Catholic churches there are. I have no idea how many mosques. I have no idea how many synagogues there are in the U.S. I'm going to guess and say there's close to 1 million houses of worship. And when we look at that 3.7% number, that includes every house of worship. So in since 2000, 25 years, less than 25 active assailant attacks in all those houses of worship. So when I go back to what this is and what this is not, just remember what the definition we're talking about. Not a bleed over crime, not somebody that launched a projectile from across the street, aiming that pistol at somebody else that had nothing to do with the church. This is premeditated, planned violence against your house of worship for the purpose of, it could be targeted or opportunistic violence, and to cause as much damage or death as possible. Okay. Good guys with guns, man. Yeah, we need an immediate response. An immediate response means there is somebody on site with a weapon that can respond to an armed threat if behavior threat detection fails, or you guys don't have that type of program, which most churches don't. Okay, most churches don't have the program. So if it fails and an adversary gets in and you don't detect it until attack execution, which is where churches are actually detecting this, which means they're responding, you need an armed responder there to stop the threat. But somebody with a pistol does not deter the threat. Let me say that one more time. Weapons don't deter the threat. They're going to plan around that threat. They're going to plan around that countermeasure. What stops them is when we see things early. It's based on sin, and we're going to talk about that later on. Seeing that early activity and observing it, and then going out and engaging with that person is what deters them. If guns stop violence, we'd have no school shootings. And if you guys can go back and look at the statistics, the majority of school shootings. So if we look at those 7 targets, okay, places of commerce and open spaces are number 1 when we talk about targets. Number 2 is going to be schools. Okay. The majority of schools that are attacked every year are public schools. And those schools primarily are middle schools and high schools. And the majority of middle schools and high schools have school resources officers, or SROs in those schools. Those SROs do not deter these 15 to 18-year-old students from attacking those schools. In some of the cases, they will attack the SRO. So the gun does not deter. The gun is a tool of response. Okay. What is going to deter is us seeing something and engaging with that person early, because it shines a light on what they're doing. Now, we don't know that. You may not know exactly what they're doing. You may just go up to engage with them and not understand at all what's happening. And that's probably going to be the case. But they believe, in a lot of cases, they have been observed or they've been discovered, and that could deter them and force them to go somewhere else. Okay. This is not a recent emergence. This is not this just didn't start 10 years ago. This is in our history as human beings. This started shortly after creation. We just have better weapons and it's better documented. Can anybody, you can come off mute. Can anybody remember when the first well-documented mass casualty attack occurred? And I'll give you a hint. It happened in the 1960s. Anybody? I'll give you another hint. It happened in the state of Texas.
If I had to say, it's probably Kent. It wasn't Kent State, was it?
No, sir. No.
Michael, if I remember correctly, I think it was the tower shooting in Texas
Yeah,
on
yeah,
got
yeah,
it.
yep. University of Austin, absolutely. Yep,
Yep.
in Austin, Texas. Yep. So Charles Whitman, kills his mother, kills his wife, and he had a brain tumor after he was killed by two police officers. Finally made their way up and they shot him. He was up. They actually did an autopsy and they split his head open. They to look to see if there was anything wrong, and there was. He did have a brain tumor. And several weeks before, months before the attack, he actually went to a doctor and started to complain about headaches and that he was having all these weird thoughts, and they ignored him. They didn't pay that much attention to him. And so, but yeah, that was the first very well televised and very well published active assailant event or mass casualty event that occurred in the United States of America, where it was live on TV. News, video was there. Newscasters were there. The news was there. They were filming the whole thing, and it took a very long time because of where he positioned himself for somebody to get up there to him and stop him. And two police officers did it. Took them forever, but they made their way up to the tower. They were able to force their way into that barricade position and shoot, kill him. And so, yeah, that was in the '60s. But so we talk about that in modern times. But I'll tell you, this is not anything new. This goes back in our history as human beings. In the very beginning of that fall in Genesis 3:15. We're going to go over that later on. So just a biblical understanding what this means. Okay. Any questions about misconceptions? And you may wonder, why are we talking about this? Well, to be successful at stopping these church attacks, it is not guns. Man, after the Mormon church attack, or the Mormon facility attack that occurred a couple of weeks ago. In fact, I've got churches all over Middle Tennessee. They're customers of mine. I have armed folks in them, and some of them are uniformed, some are plain clothes. They're behavior detection officers. They practice this BDO stuff for us, and we've got them in churches and some of the churches have volunteer teams in addition to paying me to put people there. Some of the churches pay me to come in and to put this program in place for volunteers and add those uniform folks. But every Sunday after I leave fellowship, I'm like running around checking on these folks. And the day of that attack, I just got a new customer in Green Hills, which is an affluent location in Nashville. And I'm driving up. It's the first night there. I've got an officer there, and I'm pulling up there. That attack occurred, and that entire week after that attack, because it was different. And we'll talk about that later on. That was a different attack. We talk about an adversary that planned very differently. So our threat spectrum has changed just a bit. But after that attack, man, I saw on some of these web pages, like on Facebook, like church security pages, people talking about anti-terrorism measures and vehicle barriers and, man, all this crazy stuff. And as I looked at that, I'm looking at all this information coming off these feeds, and I thought, man, first of all, most churches can't afford that. Number two, where are you going to put it? How's that fit in? So, when we start to look at these attacks, what it means, what can we do? What does all this look like? Man, there's some things they're out there right now, information being put out of things we're just not going to do in the churches, whether we don't have the budgets for them or it's just not going to fit into what we're doing. And remember, we go back to the statistics on this thing. The likelihood of this thing is really, really low. So anyway, we'll talk about that here shortly. We start talking about the Mormon attack that occurred. Okay. Any questions about those misconceptions? Anybody ever heard anything different? Assume something different? You can jump off mute, talk, doesn't matter. It's your presentation. Just don't talk all over each other. Anybody? Different assumptions? You're surprised about those statistics? Nobody? All right. That's awesome. Okay. All right. All right. Threat characteristics. Hey, this could change tomorrow. Some things to think about with the adversary that we're talking about here. A lot of times it's single adversary. Right now, for the most part, we're looking at single adversaries. That's right now. Very, very short planning cycle, which means, and I'll show you a case study later on, or we'll talk about it. It is a very short attack cycle, which means about 7 to 14 days. Go through the process of picking the targets, going out and acquiring what they need to be successful, planning, conducting their surveillance, and actually going through attack execution. Okay, so really, really short. Limited skill, which means the majority of the time, now this is a little bit different than the Mormon church a couple of weeks ago, but the majority of the time, the adversaries, especially that attack the Christian houses of worship, have never picked up a weapon, have very little skill or very little time behind weapons, the first time they've ever dealt with a weapon will be the time when they plan and prepare for the attack, the majority of the time. Okay. A little different a couple of weeks ago, but historically at the Christian churches, we're talking about folks with limited skill. All right. First time they've done it is in the attack cycle when it starts. And then I've got on here change in threat characteristics. We did see a change a couple of weeks ago. We saw a Marine Corps veteran, which he was a pogue. He wasn't, he wasn't a combat arms guy, but he was still in the Marine Corps. So he still had to go to boot camp. He had to still go through, I think I'm an old Marine, so they don't do this. So I didn't have that when I went in, but for years, I think they had this thing called MCT, where no matter what MOS you had joined for, whatever military occupational specialty, after boot camp, whether you went to San Diego or Paris Island, you went to this Marine Corps combat training. You used to do that in boot camp, and now I think they changed it and they did that after boot camp. And so he went through some sort of MCT program, but obviously he had to qualify with a rifle, probably shot a pistol at some point. He was a weapons guy. I don't think he had, and I didn't look at it too much. I don't think he had too much of a history where he couldn't have weapons. And so this guy had some experience. He had some experience with weapons. And then what was different a couple of weeks ago was in his surveillance, which they didn't talk about it, but it did happen. To do what he did, he looked to see, what do I need to do to get through this barrier? And he decided to drive a vehicle through it, in which he did, and he was successful. They thought it was a motor vehicle accident, went to rush to help him, and he gets out and starts shooting people. And so a little bit different threat characteristics. Uses a bomb or a vehicle as a ramming device to get into the barrier, which is the building. And so to get directly in, throws everybody off, and then gets out, and then not only, murders several people inside the building, but because of the damage to the vehicle and because of other things he did, it burnt the building down. So it completely destroyed the building. So very successful attack, different than what we've seen. Haven't seen that much in Christian houses of worship, but we saw it a couple of weeks ago. So a little bit of change in threat characteristics. Okay. Any questions on that? No one? Okay. All right. This comes from ASIS, American Society for Industrial Security. I've been a member for well over 20 years. I've been a chapter chair at numerous chapters. I teach, free study sessions, 12-week sessions to get folks certified in both security management and physical security. It's an international certification. So if you're in some sort of corporate security, or you do security, like you're a manager, a director for a living, for a company, for the government, ASIS is the organization where you go get certified to prove your subject matter expertise. They have standards. It's pretty expensive to belong to it every year. It's about $300 to be a member, but you get all these standards, and there's all these webinars you can get for free. And so it's a great organization. This comes from ASIS, and this is just a basic threat element diagram. And so if you look to the far right, we have threat. So that's the intent and capability of an adversary, right? So if you look in the center, this is the definition. We break this down. What is the capability? And then, sorry about that. And then what is the motivation or intent? Sorry, as I'm going through this, somebody's got a question. Go ahead and ask your question out loud. I just saw it, but I can't pop it up because I'm on this. If you've got a question, go ahead and just ask. Whoever that was, somebody asked a question in the chat. Nobody? Okay. So we have capability at the top. We have intent or motivation at the bottom. Okay. So if we look at capability and we just continue to go to the left there, capability gets into the resources that the adversary has, or the threat, and their knowledge very specifically of this facility or this target. If we go down to intent and motivation, we get into desire or attractiveness, and then we get into the actual confidence that they have to be able to conduct this attack. When we get into this with both intent and capability, so we talk about resources, knowledge, attractiveness because of the ease of the target, and then confidence, all of this requires information. So we're going to get into it. This is where we see things. When they gather information, this is where we're going to get up there, and this is where we're going to try to stop them. Okay. And so I think we're going to talk about intent first and say where the intent comes from. All right. So where does this intent come from? So questions on what we've talked about so far before I get into this? Anything? Okay, nothing. All right. So motivation and intent. Where this is our human history. Okay. So where is the desire to do this? Now, in the world, if we pay attention to the media, and I'm not saying that these are untrue sayings or the untrue statements from the media. They're going to talk about things like terrorism.
Hey, Michael,
Yes.
I apologize. There is a question in the the thread or the chat.
Yeah.
Some of us are Jewish. Are synagogues attacked differently?
They're Jewish and what?
Some of us are Jewish, so are synagogues attacked sometimes in a different
Yeah.
manner than what?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah. So absolutely they are. So yeah. So differences between, let me get into that real quick. Thanks. I couldn't see that in the chat. Thanks, Mike. If you'll
I'll
continue to
monitor it for you.
yeah. Thank you so much. So, so let me talk about the differences. And I kind of talked about that, was kind of alluding to it. So Christian houses of worship, the majority of our adversaries, our threat characteristics are these unskilled adversaries. And what that means is the majority of the time, with the exception of what we just saw from this Mormon attack, what we see is we see adversaries that have never picked up a weapon. They don't have any kind of detected violence in their background. Maybe there was violence somewhere, but it wasn't detected. The majority of them have never been arrested. And they've never had any training on attack execution. It is different with Jewish houses of worship. When you start looking at threat characteristics for those adversaries, what we see a lot of times are white supremacists, neo-Nazis because of their belief systems. And so they very specifically will target the Jewish houses of worship, and they are experienced in those specific skills. They have those skills because they belong to groups, terrorist organizations that provide that training. And so the threat characteristics for Jewish houses of worship are different. They are different than those of the Christian faith. And so that person is absolutely correct. And so I kind of touched on that, just quickly, but that is absolutely true. So the Jewish houses of worship, their threat characteristics are different. Okay. Like, are they asking if you want to kind of read those questions off for me? Sorry, because I think there's two more in the chat.
That was it. One of them, it was probably not completed. Hey, just on an interesting note, the Marine shooter at the Mormon church in the Marine Corps, he was a motor pool worker, vehicle retrieving. So interesting that he used at least one piece of equipment that he was familiar with.
Yeah. And I mean, it is a conversation. How do we stop motor vehicles? And if you guys are thinking about that, hey, stop it in the early phases of this thing, which we're going to get into, when they're there 2 weeks before, looking around and it's an anomaly and you guys see it and you go up and engage with that person. Because when we get into that here shortly, when you see these things early, they're not there to attack and probably won't have a weapon with them. They're just there to gather information. So where does all this come from? All right, guys, you got, our history. God creates us, and in Genesis 1:31 very specifically says, and everything he created was good. So when we talk about the creation of the human race, Adam and Eve, when they were created, they were innocent. They had the ability not to sin. And then we start getting in Genesis 2:15, right there at 2:15, 2:16, we see that the Lord gives Adam the law. Like, he gives him the law. He says, hey, there's some rules I have to follow. So, in Reformed theology, we call this the covenant of works, which means Adam and Eve were put on probation. They were born innocent. They had the ability not to sin. And so there's this test. God says, hey, everything here is yours except for the fruit on that tree. For the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. And the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die, both of physical and spiritual death. So he gives them the law. There is a covenant made. It's an agreement, right, between God and Adam and Eve. If you do this, then you get this forever. You're going to live with me in paradise and you're innocent. But the day that you do this and you break this law, here's what's going to happen. So one, we see that creation was like human beings were created, they were innocent. They were good. All of creation was good. It says that very specifically in Genesis 2. And then or Genesis 1. And then as we get into Genesis 2, God gives Adam and Eve the law, or, gives it to Adam. And then what happens, at some point, and we get into Genesis 3, there is temptation. And, the way that Satan tempts Adam and Eve is he gets them to question God's knowledge, and they fall. They do sin. They do take this fruit and they eat of it. And the moment that they eat of it, they fall, and we start to see the impact. We start to see shame, right? So God is looking for them in the garden. Now, God is 100% sovereign. Well before he created anybody, he knew what every one of us were going to do, how we were going to fall, and knew Adam and Eve were going to fall. In fact, that's we start talking about the good news of the gospel. Like, he made a way, for us to live with him forever. For some of us, because we know everybody doesn't go to heaven. And so he knew that. Now, he knew Adam and Eve was going to fall. But after they eat of the tree, and now their eyes are open, God's looking for them in the garden, and he calls out to them, "Where are you?" And they admit, "Hey, we're hiding. Why are you hiding from me?" "Well, because we were naked." "How do you know that you were naked? How do you know you're naked?" Of course, he knew why. He wanted them to admit it. And so obviously they start to talk about what happened, right? Because they're trying to cover themselves. So we see shame. First sin we see is shame. And then the second thing is he starts to ask why. And we see that Adam starts to blame somebody. He blames Eve, "The woman that you gave me," right? And so this is blame. And really what this is anger. And then same thing, the woman, Eve, starts to put this on somebody else. "Well, the serpent, he tempted me." Okay. And so we see fear because they're afraid. They hide from the Lord. We see shame, which mixes with the fear. We see anger, we see blame, and we see this very sinful nature when we see the world start to fall. And it doesn't get any better. Like, we have not changed. Nothing is new. We live in this fallen, sinful cycle, and that is clearly in Scripture. Okay. And so it doesn't get any better. We start to see the first act of predatory violence. So God doesn't kill Adam and Eve right away. In fact, he blesses them. He feeds them. He clothes them. He allows them to procreate, because that's what we were designed to do. And their first two sons, as they have their first two sons, we see the first act of predatory violence. And we see that sinful nature of the parents come out. We see this imputed sin on Cain. And because of this anger, because of this offering, and because of Cain's heart, we see him start to plan this violence. In Scripture, it says it clearly, depending on what translation you're going to read there in the Old Testament, but it says either Cain talked to his brother, or Cain led his brother to the field. There was pre-planning in it. In fact, it was in his mind, and God called out Cain about it, and even said, "Hey, if you let this anger overtake you, it is going to jump on you, and literally it is going to ruin you. It's going to kill you." And that's exactly what happens. And so he kills his brother in the first act of predatory violence, and nothing gets any better. Nothing is different. I see comments like, "In the world we live in today." Folks, there's no world that we live. There's no difference in the world we live in today than the world in Genesis 4, Genesis 3:15. It is just a fallen world. Nothing has changed. We just have better weapons, than we have media that exacerbates this and can produce this quickly so we can see it. It doesn't get any better. After Genesis 4, we start to get into Genesis 5, and we start to see this line of Cain. Now, luckily, Adam and Eve are blessed, and there's another son. But we see this evil line of Cain and what happens, and we see the evilness of people. And man got so evil that God killed everybody but 8 people. Let me say it one more time. Our evilness, our sin, right? And it's no different today, except obviously as believers, we are saved and we see things and we can understand things. We still have indwelling sin. We see that in the New Testament with Paul, because he talks about it in Romans, very specifically Romans 7:18 through 7:21. He's talking about himself. He's talking about us. And so even though we are saved, and we are saved by grace through Christ, we do still have indwelling sin, and we battle with that. Now, the good thing about a believer, we can understand it, and we actually, through the Holy Spirit, can fight that. We can resist it. The adversary that we are fighting cannot. These people, I don't care if it's a Jewish house of worship, Christian house of worship, the adversaries that we are fighting do not believe in God and they do not fear him. They do not believe in him and they don't fear him. And so this indwelling sin that they have is like, John talks about it in the New Testament. It is like a roaring river that overtakes them. And so the motivation intent comes from sinful man and who we are. Nothing has changed. Nothing about sinful man has changed. Now, there obviously for Christians, we have the good news of the gospel, and those that are in Christ, we understand this. The Holy Spirit helps us with this, but understand, it doesn't matter. The synagogues, the churches, we are fighting the same adversary. Somebody who does not fear God, someone who hates God, someone who has allowed sin to overtake them. And so this is where the intent and the motivation comes from. We hear words like terrorism. We hear words like transgenderism. We hear mental illness. Yes, that's part of the fall. But what we are fighting is what we have always fought after Genesis 3:15, and that is our sinful nature. That is the adversary that we're fighting. The difference between us and them is we know God and they do not. That's who we're fighting. It is very important to take a biblical perspective on what this is, what this looks like, and who it is that we're dealing with. Okay. If you want to know more about this, you can go into the New Testament and the Old Testament too. Like the Old Testament is the guidebook, right? It tells us everything that we need to know about us and about God. But we can go in the New Testament, we can go into Romans very specifically, and we can learn more about this desire to sin and how we battle that through the help of the Holy Spirit. Okay. Something else in the chat, Mike, something come up. Do we have anything new?
It's just an affirmation from Janie. This is a spiritual battle.
Gotcha. Absolutely. Okay. All right, guys. So we talked about motivation and intent. Let's talk about capability real quick. All right. Man, this is the picture of, what happened a couple of weeks ago. This is absolutely horrible. Now, up until a couple of weeks ago, this was threat characteristics for Jewish houses of worship, because there's actually been vehicles where adversaries have tried to use vehicles and ram them into synagogues and other Jewish houses of worship. We really haven't had that. And so unfortunately, the Mormon church experienced this 2 weeks ago. And so, yes, vehicle barriers and sandbags and people with AR-15s or AR-10s and designated marksmen on the roof. Yeah, that would help stop, fight this kind of thing. But guess what? I probably can speak for the synagogues too. The churches are probably not going to do that. There's not the budget. And number two, obviously, we want people to come in and worship. We want them to hear the gospel. We want them to hear the good news. So what we're looking at right now is behavior threat detection, because we want to try to prevent it. We don't want to try to fight it. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the capability piece as we get into this other part. So the capability, where does it come from? The bad guy, doesn't matter who the bad guy is. So we're talking about these haters of God, these folks that indwelling sin has overcome them because they don't understand what it is, whether they're going to attack a synagogue or they're going to attack the church. These folks have to conduct a terrain analysis. And what that means is they are going to gather very specific information about the facility. And this is what it is that we're looking for. Now, it's not like they're going to sneak on the site, right? They're going to pull up and they're going to observe and they're going to look. And in that terrain analysis, what they're going to very specifically look for, number one, is what it is they can see. So they're going to have to see it, whether it's a synagogue, it's a church, it's a mosque, it's a temple, whatever. They're going to have to come take a look at it. They're going to look at it online first and get information, but they're going to have to show up and they're going to have to take a look at the facility. Why do they have to see the facility in person? Not just from the spiritual standpoint, but from the adversary standpoint, from this worldly standpoint. Why do they have to show up first? Why do they need to come look at it before they attack it?
So they know what they're walking into.
Yeah, man, they have to validate, is this going to be something I can do? Can I do this? Number one, can I do it? Meaning, is somebody going to observe me or see me? So can I stay covered and concealed? And in behavior threat detection, what that means, concealment just means they're hidden in their surveillance. Surveillance is, basically just hiding in plain sight. And then the cover piece of it is like if we come up and ask them a question, Are they going to lie about it? How are they going to lie? What does that mean? And so, yeah, they need to validate. Validation in our sinful nature is necessary. Let me say that one more time. Validation in our sinful nature is necessary because we question everything. We question God. We question the ability of ourselves. It is the fallen nature of humankind. And so they're going to show up because they have to validate and they have to gather this information. The requirements for a successful attack include information on the target, the element of surprise, control, which is why they use weapons, and the ability to be mobile. If we take any of those four things away, they cannot be successful in the attack. That is basic attack preventative measures, understanding what's necessary for the bad guy or the adversary to be successful. Okay. So there's deception. We see this in Genesis 3. I've already talked about this in Genesis 3:3-6. We see these emotions going on with Adam and Eve after the fall. We see it. We see shame. We see fear. We see anxiety. And that's exactly what the adversary is going through. They have to validate. So they're going to show up on site. The only attack in modern times that I know of, the documented attack, it wasn't a church, it was actually a city, was in 2008 in Mumbai. Those 10 adversaries were basically kids that Lashkar-e-Taiba pulled out of Pakistan, and they trained them for about 7 months. And the only reason they did not conduct the on-site surveillance was because they couldn't. They didn't have the ability to. They were being trained at the time. And Lashkar-e-Taiba actually, so it's an Islamic terrorist organization out of Pakistan who targets India specifically. They had a on-site surveillant in one of the hotels, living in the hotel. So that was one of the targets, and he was able to surveil the other 4 sites, which included a Jewish house that housed Jewish folks. And he was able to gather the information for 2 years and feed it back to Lashkar-e-Taiba. He was actually a paid informant for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration while he was doing this. The DEA at first was unaware of what was going on, but later on they found out. And so they actually used this on-site informant for 2 years while they were training these basically 18, 19-year-old kids to conduct this attack that took 72 hours to stop. If you don't know much about it, just look it up. It's the Mumbai. They just call it the 2008 Mumbai attack. There's an awesome book about it. It's about a 500-page book. It's a long read, but man, it's an awesome read. I started studying the attack right after it happened, and there's a lot of good information about adversary planning in that book. So anyway, that's the only modern attack that I know of where the on-site surveillance was not conducted by adversaries, and there are two specific reasons for that. Number one, they were training those adversaries in the mountains of Pakistan for this attack. And number two, they had an on-site surveillance feeding information back to the terrorist organization in Pakistan. Okay. So capability comes through. We see this threat model and very specifically this adversary attack methodology. And what this means is the actions they have to take that's very specific. It's very noticeable. So it's things that we can see based on our pattern analysis. Okay. Now, let me get into this validation. And I know our Jewish friends that are with us tonight, they treat things a little bit differently. I've had a little bit of experience with them. I've got a customer that's a synagogue, and at a church where we want to welcome everybody in, but our Jewish friends have kind of learned some hard lessons. And so because of that, it's a little bit more difficult. Like if I just want to show up at a synagogue and I'm not Jewish and I'm not part of that congregation, I think it's probably a little bit more difficult for me just to walk in to see something, right? Based on my experience with synagogues. So with that, especially with us, validation is very important because of our mission, because we are different. We do want people to come in because we haven't experienced what they've experienced yet. We're starting to see it, but we're a little bit behind the synagogues when it comes to victims of attacks. And so when we start talking about this, what we're looking at is not profiling. We're not looking at skin color, socioeconomic status, their sex. None of that has anything to do with a threat. It's got to do with what they're doing, with their behavior, and that is their signature. This technique is not all Israeli, but that's where I learned it. I mean, I learned it in Israel. And so we go back into the 70s, very specifically in 1972, prior to 72, Israeli security forces did profile, and what they were profiling was terrorist organizations. They were hijacking their planes, El Al planes. They got very good at profiling, very specifically their adversaries, who were Palestinians or who were Arabs. And so they could, very quickly and very effectively identify their adversaries as these folks were trying to get on these flights. They would profile them, they asked them questions. They wouldn't allow on the flights, and they were able to stop a large amount of hijackings because of profiling. Now, adversaries will adapt to their adversary, to the security forces, right? And that's what they did. So a Palestinian terrorist organization specifically started to figure out what El Al security was doing. And so what they did is they reached out to a left-wing terrorist organization, basically based out of Europe, but they had a Japanese faction, or the Red Army faction. They had like a Japanese arm. And so they went to the Red Army faction in Japan, and they paid 3 terrorists to get on an El Al flight to go all the way to Tel Aviv. At the time it was Lod Airport. Now it's Ben Gurion. At the time it was Lod, because they knew, or they assumed, that El Al security, because these were Asians, would not profile them. And they were absolutely right. They didn't. And so these folks were able to get on the plane. Now security measures were a little bit different. So they didn't screen bags, but you could put the bags, in the passenger compartment. They load them on the plane. And so the adversaries were actually able to load weapons in these guitar cases, because their cover story was they were going to Tel Aviv to do, they were musicians and they were going to do something somewhere. And so they let them in, and they were Asian. So nothing popped up, that made them suspicious. And then they landed at Lod there at Ben Gurion. When they got to baggage claim, they got the weapons out and they conducted this attack. They killed 26 people, injured 80. Israeli security forces killed 2 of the terrorists, and were actually able to capture 1. And then the Palestinian group took, obviously claimed responsibility very quickly, because it was a success to them. And El Al Airlines and the Israeli government said, hey, we cannot profile anymore. We need to understand what we did, like what's the learning experience out of this. And now what we need to look for is behavior. It doesn't matter the color of their skin, their nationality, what they look like. This is about how they're going to act. And so they changed their questioning. They changed their security tactics. They changed everything they did. And man, I've been I'm 58 years old. I joined the Marine Corps at 17. For 22 years, I was a government employee in some form or fashion, designing security programs and, protecting our critical infrastructure. I've had an awesome career, and I will tell you, my time in Israel, both working there and studying there, was some of the best training I've ever had. And so they look at things very differently. So that's where a lot of this comes from. And so we're not profiling, number one, because our Jewish friends understood that that's not what we need to do. They took that lesson, and so we need to understand that, number one, because it doesn't work. And number two, very specifically in the Christian houses of worship, profiling doesn't work. We conflict against the mission. We conflict with the mission of the church if we profile. And so that doesn't work for us. We're not going to do that. And we learned a long time ago, it just doesn't work anyway. So this is about behavior. It is not about profiling.
Hey, Michael, quick comment in the from Ed. Thanks, Ed. Ed states that he's protected synagogues for the past 10 years. He uses a very specific greeting on the Sabbath to every person wanting to enter. The ones that do not respond properly have a distinct reaction to my greetings. This gives us the reason to engage more.
Yep. And that's all this is. It is observing something that's an anomaly, which we'll get into, engaging with that person in a very friendly manner. And if we see very specific behavior that is against the pattern that's expected, then we either ask more questions or we deny access, right? So El Al would say, hey, what are you going to put them on the airplane or not? That's the question that they ask. Are we going to let them board the airplane, or we're not going to let them board the airplane? And so in this case, are we going to give them access to the sanctuary, or are we not going to give them access to the sanctuary church? And so absolutely, that's the way to do it. Now, the validation piece is important. Sometimes we make bad decisions and we turn people away. I would say any place I've deployed this, from fellowship to the churches where I've taught these techniques, very few times are we going to deny anybody access. And I'll get into that when we start talking about what is our nature. I'll talk about why that's important and understanding that. Remember, there is risk based on our fleshiness, right? So while we're in these fleshy bodies, we are still sinful. We see things as we are, not as they really are. We and our fallen nature are unable to see people the way they actually are. We are going to see them through our eyes, which is a fallen, a sinful body. And so we have to be really careful. That's why validation is really, really important in this. Okay. So that's the capability piece. All right. Questions about that, the origin, where it comes from, why it is we're talking about the Old Testament, the Bible, why it is we need to look at it this way. It's important that we understand that where this comes from, we understand our history and who it is we're fighting. We are fighting a spiritual battle. We can call it terrorism, we can call it mental illness, whatever, folks. It is, it's just the fallen world. Okay. All right. All right. Threat classification. Let's talk about that. Okay. We have basically, for you folks who have been following me for a couple of years, and Ed's one of them. And Ed, I appreciate you coming back, my friend. And I think we've got somebody else on here from another Jewish house of worship that I haven't seen in a while. So we talk about three categories of general threats. Today, we're talking about the intentional threats, right? Trying to stop that active assailant. And there are other intentional threats. We have sexual predators. We have people that want to commit crimes, arson. The Jewish houses of worship see this very often. They see a lot of vandalism or attempted vandalism. We see that at churches, but I think we see it at synagogues a lot more. But there are also unintentional threats. And those are your medical emergencies, your slips, trips, and falls, your accidents. Those are actually the second leading cause of death in the United States of America. Or I'm sorry, the third leading cause of death. First is heart disease, second is cancer, and third are these accidents. So unintentional incidents or threats are probably the most likely at the churches that we are going to experience. Okay. And then we've got the natural threats, which have to do with the weather. We're going to focus on intentional threat categories, but just understand in general, if you're writing out a physical security plan, or if you're doing some sort of assessment or survey, you're trying to validate this to your house of worship, understand just in general, there are three classifications or categories for threats, and you need to address all three categories in your physical security plan. Okay. Now, let me get into this likelihood piece. So if I type in church attacks in 2024 in YouTube, this is what comes up: 415 church attacks. And then I go back to the FBI data and I go, well, no, that's not true, because there were only really in like 24, like one or two active assailant attacks at a house of worship. Where are these 415 church attacks coming from? What does that mean? Well, it's not an active assailant attack. What we tend to see, and this is from this report, but when you first see that, you think, oh my gosh, we better hire contract security. We better have Leos on site. We need to have a designated marksman on the roof. We probably need to have vehicle barrier systems. Here's where these numbers come from. And that's a report that comes from the Family Resource Council from FRC. Out of those 415 incidents, over half of them were vandalism. It was vandalism. The most common category of attacks, and I say that air fingers, were incidents of vandalism or some sort of property crime. And then we talk about these notable spike of gun-related incidents more than doubled. What they mean is there's some sort of an injury on site, and most of them come from something that's not affiliated with the church. It's this bleed over. A gangster across the street, launches a projectile, and it comes across the street and it hits the building of the church. There's an armed robbery in the parking lot that has nothing to do with the congregant or the church itself. Or there's something that goes on around the church because of where the church or the house of worship is located. And there are these crime stats and these things that occur that are claimed as these attacks. And so it has nothing to do with active violence. So just understand, we see these high attack numbers. This is based off of a blending of different types of events to include vandalism, arson, property related or resource driven crimes. Okay. So when you guys classify your threats, when we start talking about this behavior threat detection, we have insider threats, we have outsider threats. Very simply, an insider threat is going to be somebody that has knowledge of the physical protection system, and they could have knowledge because maybe they were a former congregant. They have access to the site. maybe during the week they're a vendor and they're delivering things to your church, and so we let them in, and so they're walking around the church and they're delivering things there. So it's somebody that has information about your system, your protection system, and most of the time that's because at some point they had access. When I teach this to schools, the majority of, when we start talking about public schools, about 85% of all adversaries in public schools, active assailants, are insiders. They're either students, former students, somebody that's affiliated with a staff member, etc. So in schools, insiders are usually students. In the churches, if it's an insider, it is a congregate, a former congregate, or somebody that just had access to the church and they have information about our system. The outsider threats are those people that in general really don't have any, they don't have any knowledge of the physical protection system. They've not had access to the church. They've just picked the church or the synagogue as a target. And so they're just going to have to gather more information. Now, both of these require planning. They require some sort of, planning to make this successful and make sure it's successful. And so there is these detectable elements in it, if that makes sense. So when we talk about this behavior threat detection, remember, there are both insider and outsider threats that we have to deal with. Okay. Questions on that? Nobody? All right. Attack characteristics. Okay. If we go back to these threat elements, folks, specific noticeable actions. Okay. So as I get into this, the first piece of this is going to be, if you haven't done it, do a pattern analysis or conduct a pattern analysis for your house of worship. And here's how you do this. This is the very first thing I do in this training process. And so if I've got a church or I've got a synagogue or whatever, the very first thing we'll do after we go through what behavior threat detection is you do a pattern analysis. And that pattern analysis, using both your outer layer, middle layer, and inner layer, you determine based off people, vehicles, behavior, hand carried items, whatever, what the norm or what the expected behavior looks like. What that looks like on a Sunday, what that looks like on a Wednesday, what it looks like on a Saturday service during a special event. And depending on the event, the pattern may be different. The pattern at Fellowship Bible Church on a Sunday is very different than the pattern at Fellowship Bible Church on a Wednesday night when we have 400 high school and middle school kids on the campus running around 30 acres like little maniacs. So it's different on Wednesday than it is on Sunday. It is going to be different also at your house of worship. So every service or event that you have that is a standard service, so you've got your standard worship services, you've got your youth, whatever, those patterns are going to be different. It may take, depending on the size of the church, the size of your ministry, your security ministry, it may take a couple of hours to sit down and go through this pattern analysis. Once you develop that pattern analysis, at that point, what happens is you can start to determine what the anomalies are based on behavior, belongings, context, you name it, which the Israelis call behavioral and contextual indicators. You can determine what that anomaly is. And that's what you look for. You don't look for what you expect. Okay. With those anomalies, what we start to look for very specifically are threat elements, these very specific noticeable actions. Depending on what method you're talking about or what you use, this could be a cycle or some sort of a pathway for the adversary. And these are these very noticeable actions that they're going to take. Now, unfortunately, in this path or cycle, we're only going to see one or two of these. We won't see the majority of these elements. We're not going to see them plan. We're not going to see them conduct surveillance offsite, which means they're online. We're not going to see them pick the target initially because they're going to pick the target away from the church or the synagogue. They're going to probably do that at home. But what we can see is when they show up. So once we understand our pattern analysis and know what that looks like, and then we start to pick out what these behaviors look like, once they show up, that's going to be an anomaly. They're going to do some things different than what everybody else does. And there's some, depending on the adversary, depending on the house of worship, depending on what's going on at the time, like what you've got going on at your synagogue or church, when the adversary shows up, those actions are going to be different. So we have to understand our pattern and what's our expected pattern before we can see the anomalies. And very specifically in hostile surveillance, we're talking about, surveillance requires a platform, which means something that they're going to sit in or be posted in or on while they're observing the target. That could be a vehicle. I don't know. It could be a wood lawn if they want to be really sneaky. It could be a matter, it could be a number of things. They can be mobile, right? So they could be moving around, or they could be static. They could be doing this. They could conduct this hostile surveillance statically from their car, or they could get up and they could come in and take a look around. Any way that they conduct this, whether they're mobile or static, there's going to be some things about them that are going to be different. And when you see those things, you go up and you engage with them. Okay. So this is what we're not doing. Anytime when we have a church attack and I see that, I hear that a police officer responded and shot the adversary, or a security team, had to respond. We had one, a couple months ago in Michigan, where the adversary was just stupid, wasn't very smart, because they're all stupid, but none of them are smart. But when he showed up and he gets out in the attack, he's dressed in some obvious clothing, that doesn't fit in. That I think it was like he was wearing like all black or something. And he got out of the car with a weapon to start moving toward the sanctuary. And luckily there was like an elder or something in the parking lot sitting in his truck. And he sees this guy with a weapon that's not concealed. And, unfortunately for the adversary, the elder ran him over with his truck. And then they called for a security team member. And while the security team member responded, even though he hit him with a car, the guy was still armed and he shot the security team member in the leg, but the security team member did shoot him. And I think they neutralized the threat. So what we're looking for is very specific things before that. Then that was successful because they saw him in attack execution, but they saw him in the early stages and they were able to stop him in the parking lot based on his lack of effective planning, which is, hey, keep the weapon concealed until you get the target, right? It's the element of surprise, which he did not practice. So that is the adversary attack methodology. We have these threat elements, which you see on the right over there from ASIS, and then we have the cycler pathway. And once we determine what our pattern is, then we look at this adversary attack methodology, which helps us build our case to go up and have that conversation. Okay. Play this video. I think you'll see it. Hopefully that'll play it. Most of you guys have seen this before. This was the attack on Family Research Council back in 2012. We had this pro-gay marriage guy that decided to attack Family Research Council. The reason why he was so successful was because he went through this entire process I just talked about, was able to breach their security protocols twice, including the first time in hostile surveillance, and here at the second time when he actually went through attack execution. The security guard here, who's in plain clothes, it's Leo Johnson, figures out that something's wrong. In that backpack is a pistol, 2 extra magazines, specifically a SIG P228 or 229, 229, and then a bunch of Chick-fil-A sandwiches. He was going to run with the 15 victims' faces because at the time Chick-fil-A was outwardly against gay marriage. Johnson is able to wrestle the pistol. Now he got shot twice. He's able to wrestle the handgun away from Corkins, the adversary, and able to stop the attack from occurring. But this adversary, within about 7 days, went through the entire cycle to include the planning and the preparation, and was actually successful in the attack. Leo was harmed, but he did not die. And the adversary was able to get into the building twice, including attack execution, through ruse, like he made up a story. He was able to get in. Okay. Questions on those threat characteristics? Questions on the pattern analysis. Now, let's talk about questioning just very quickly. This is not a threat, the behavior threat index class. I can't teach that in an hour and a half. I'm just giving you guys the highlights of it and why it's important. The importance to this is you are seeing the attack or the actual adversary attack methodology in the early stages of planning. When they're conducting their hostile surveillance, they are doing this to gather information. Can they be successful? Will they be observed? Can they figure out where the largest target area is? Can they get access to that target area? Can they do that without being detected? These are all the things in that terrain analysis that they're trying to figure out. They do not have to have any type of training to be successful at this. Floyd Lee Corkins, that attacker that you just saw, had no violent history, had never picked up a weapon prior to this attack, knew nothing about handguns, knew nothing about attack planning. This is Genesis 3 and Genesis 4 history for the human race. That's all this is. Okay. Questions about threat characteristics, behavior threat detection before we get into solutions and next steps for you guys?
Mike, I have one question.
Yes, sir.
So, what do you say to the churches about like online evaluations or assessments of like open source related to these attackers, where they've actually like posted about this beforehand, or what information do you have about that as far as in a lot of these examples, did any of these people post things ahead of time or like emails to the church or threats made prior to these attacks?
Yeah, good question. So anytime we go through this process in our sinful nature, there is leakage, in like threat assessment methodology, we call it leakage, which means there may be some communication, unfortunately. And there's a really good book out. It's called, it was written by a U.S. Marshal who later became a psychiatrist or clinical psychologist who studied threat behavior. He became an expert for years in protecting federal judges. I've studied their material and went through their certification process a long time ago. It's called, oh man, I've lost it. Hunters and Howlers. And basically, I think that's the name of it. And the saying is, howlers never hunt and hunters never howl. And what that means is the adversary is never going to communicate with the target or with the law enforcement organization that they're going to attack. So you're not going to get a warning prior to the attack. So the church, somebody's not going to call the church up and say, hey, I'm showing up tomorrow with a pistol, going to kill 26 people. Now, here's what they might do. And we see this when we get information on the case studies. There is some communication to their family members, or sometimes there is information that is leaked out where they will say, man, you know what? I'm tired. I'm tired of these Jews running the country. Like this is true statements made by adversaries in case studies. I'm tired of, that they've ruined the country, and you know what? Somebody needs to go into one of these synagogues and kill a bunch of people. Or I'm tired of the Christians. This is a true statement that was actually made by the adversary that you guys just saw. Man, I'm tired of these Christians talking about, a man can't marry a man, a woman can't marry a woman. Somebody needs to do something about this. Somebody needs to attack a church or attack one of these Christian organizations and teach them a lesson. So that is communicated, but it's never communicated to the target. And obviously it's never communicated to law enforcement, but it can be leaked or communicated to close family, like close friends, family members, or coworkers. The problem is they don't take them serious, or they just don't say anything. Does that make sense? That answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So they're smart enough, like not to warn the threat. And we saw that in Cain, like God knew it. We read it, going to the Pentateuch there and read it in Genesis 3, right? We can see that, obviously God saw it, and, he didn't warn his brother, he didn't tell his brother before he took him out in the field and him over the rock, he was going to do something. So, yeah. So unfortunately they don't warn us. And remember, go back to the attack characteristics, right? I talked about it. There are 4 requirements for a successful attack. Number 1 is the element of surprise. So they don't tell us. Number 2 is information. They've got to get information on the target. They need to be mobile, and they have to have control, which is what the weapon's about. And they got to be able to move around while they're inside that facility. The moment that we're able to actually stop them from moving, then that stops the attack. My experience in active assailants is me actually a long time ago, and I hated police work. That's why I left it. But I was a full-time SWAT guy in Nashville for a long time. And my first year on SWAT, before we went full-time, we were still like, part-time at the time, but we were very busy. We did a lot of work outside of our normal working hours. We had an active assailant situation that turned into a hostage situation, and it stopped the attack. And the reason why is he went in and attacked and started shooting people. It was at a Kroger. He started shooting people up front. He shot several people before he was actually stopped. 2 Metro policemen, 2 patrol officers were actually in the parking lot when the attack occurred. And so they ran down there. They jumped out of their cars and ran down there, and they started shooting at him through the glass. And he went from being mobile to static, and he took this girl hostage. And when we got there, we had to rescue her. And so that turned an event that was mobile, right? He was mobile, so it was active. But as soon as they responded, they were able to pin him up. He barricaded himself and took her hostage. So the active part of it stopped, right? So it was no longer an active threat. It was a very static or barricaded situation. So yeah, just go back to those attack requirements, and that'll tell you, they're probably not going to tell us because they need that element of surprise. Anybody else? Any other questions? All right, let's get into solutions and next steps. All right, guys. If you, I know the synagogues do this. Yeah, like I said, I've got the folks that are on here from synagogues. I think I know the majority of you folks. And Ed, again, welcome back. Sorry, I haven't done this in a while. It's good to see you. I know the synagogues are doing this. If you're a church and you're not doing it, I would just suggest that you do or start going through the process of looking at this. The likelihood of these active assailant attacks is low. The problem is risk is always likelihood times vulnerability times consequence, and we can never change the impact or consequence number in risk. And so even though the likelihood is low, consequence is always going to be high. And if you don't have these planning tools in place, your vulnerability number is high. So if I've got a high, and a low, guess what? You've got a high, there's this high risk level for this, even though this doesn't happen a lot. So if you look at risk, and if we did a true risk assessment, there'd be some things that you guys need to do to mitigate that number. And that's what this gets into. So guys, and ladies, if you haven't done a threat analysis, if there's not been some physical security planning, and you don't have training standards for your team, it doesn't matter how big or how small you are. These are 3 elements that you need to start looking at. And I'm going to get into them here step by step for you. Okay. So not just the behavior detection piece. So the threat analysis, there's some assessment methodologies that help you guys with this. Now, you can just have a threat assessment done. I do threat assessments very quickly. I can turn them around like a day and a half, and they're not super expensive, and they tell you exactly what your threats are, but that's only one piece. So you can do just a threat assessment. That'll tell you what your threats are, what the likelihood looks like of those threats, and that's going to give you the basic information on what you need. That's one assessment that is a standalone methodology or document that you can have that gives you kind of your design basis threat. Most of the time with a threat assessment, I'll add the DBT and I'll talk about capabilities and that kind of stuff in the threat assessment so you guys have it. So that's one thing. It's easy. It's fast. I turn those around quick. Most people that know how to do threat assessments can. Now, the more comprehensive would be kind of a light PSA or physical security assessment, which is a security survey. A security survey most of the time does not include a threat assessment. I'll usually put a threat statement in the security survey, but the security survey just goes in and it analyzes what you're currently doing, any problems that you've had in the past, and it makes recommendations for improvements so that you can firm your security up. So that's a security survey. They're normally quicker than a physical security assessment. It doesn't necessarily it does point your vulnerabilities out when it gets into recommendations, but it doesn't focus on it. It just focuses on, okay, I'll put a quick threat statement in it. What are you doing? What have you had to deal with in the past? And what are the recommendations to help you guys improve security? So it's almost like a compliance document, if that makes sense. Okay. So it reviews what you've got and it tells you what you need to put in place. Now, the physical security assessment is this full service document that does a couple things. It includes a threat assessment. It includes a site characterization, which includes what you're currently doing from a physical security standpoint. It includes a vulnerability assessment, which is your system weaknesses, the things that you're not doing. And then it also includes the recommendations. So it's the full piece. It does everything. I would say most churches probably don't need full PSAs. Most of them can do just fine with a security survey. It's faster. It still provides the information they need, and it gives them a roadmap forward because the survey is going to tell them what they need to do. But the PSA just gives them more data and gives you gives you guys a better idea to take a look at yourselves and see what's happening. So this is your threat analysis piece. If you haven't at least done a threat assessment, get a threat assessment done. You need to do that. If not, you're making assumptions. Again, the biggest threat you're probably going to have is those unintentional threats, but it's good to identify those, point those out, document it, have it, because this goes back to your return on investment. So every year, if they're asking, do we need this? What is this costing? And why do we continue to put God's resources toward this? At a minimum, a threat assessment can show why. So not only are you understanding what your problem is and what you're trying to defend the church against or the synagogue, but you've got documentation for your return on investment or your ROI. Okay. All right. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Surveys are the next, like I said, surveys are quick. Most churches, if you want something comprehensive, the survey is really what most churches use. I've done a lot of PSAs for synagogues, especially when they're going in, every year for that nonprofit security grant. They want as much information as they can get so they can turn that information in, to hopefully get, the largest amount of award they can get from the government. Churches are starting to do that now too. Okay. Design strategies. The first design, this includes any site that you protect. I have designed security programs for nuclear and chemical facilities, large manufacturing sites, data centers, VIPs, high-risk people, churches, synagogues, ministries, Christian camps, you name it, I've done it. I've designed a physical protection program for it. Been in this a long time. This is included in these three strategies in anything that you're designing. And the first is conflict avoidance. Specifically for the church folks, your physical protection program cannot conflict with the mission of the organization. Let me say that one more time. I put this on a posting on a Facebook on one of these church security groups this morning. Somebody was talking about suspicious activity a couple of days ago, and I saw it, and it almost enrages me when I see the guy was acting suspicious. What was he doing? Well, he keeps going in his pocket. Well, you're suspicious. You're a Genesis 3:15 human being. Everybody here is suspicious. What are you talking? There's nothing suspicious about somebody going in their pockets. And so conflict avoidance means that we don't conflict with the mission. And so we need to validate why something's a problem before we stop somebody and kick them out. The church is not an airport. We are not TSA agents. And newsflash, TSA sucks. TSA security is absolutely atrocious. So not only are they bad at security, they create false positives. So we are not, when it comes to behavior detection. So we are not TSA. We don't, we should not be searching backpacks unless we can validate that backpack's a threat. Because, and I remember this, my children are grown now. They're, my boys are out of college. They're successful sales guys now. My daughter's in college. And, but I remember the days when they were little and their mother had a big bag and it had a breast pump in it and goldfish and a stuffed animal and whatever else we could cram in there. Because when we dropped them off before service in the children's ministry, we need to make sure that they were happy and comfortable while they were learning about Noah's Ark or whatever cartoon that they were showing at the children. And I'm not shining bad light on children's ministry. It's just my Reformed theology coming out. But I'm just, the things that we did when they were little, right? And so a backpack is not bad by itself. And so I say that to say, if we're doing something from a security standpoint that conflicts with the mission, and in the church, that is the spread of the gospel, then we are doing something bad. We are doing something we should not do. A big part of this behavior threat detection, the Southern Baptists are awesome at this. They have these first impression teams. And these are people that are out there that are greeting people because they're trying to get them in and get them to come to chicken dinners and get them to fill these cards out so they can go to Sunday school and join the Southern Baptist Convention or whatever it is that Southern Baptist churches do. But I mean, they're awesome at this. They're not doing security, but that's the model, right? And so we want to be out there in behavior threat detection because that's what we have to do. We're out there engaging, we're observing, and we're detecting things early. And when we do that, this helps this conflict avoidance because we're actually engaging with the people, okay? And we can determine early if it's a problem or not. Number 2 is defense in depth, and that's that layered approach. I have to have people on the outer layer. I have to have people in the middle layer, and I have to have people on the inside of the building. And I don't mean covert, folks. Covert protection is a separate skill. It's hard to learn and teach, and we do not need covert protection in the church. We do not. You need low profile people that are dressed like everybody else, and you can put a name tag on them or, with the church logo on it, greeting people, looking at people, talking to them and engaging with them. That is what's going to stop this attack execution. Because when you're observing people, the adversary will believe that he has been spotted. Even if we don't spot them, even if we don't, they will believe that they've been spotted. That happens. I know we've been successful at it, and we got the data to prove it. Functions of physical security, guys, that's your deterrence, detection, delay, and response. Those are those 4 functions. You're doing that if you've got the layered approach and you got your ARM programs in place and you're doing behavior threat detection. Those are your physical security standards. Okay. Training standards. It doesn't matter how big or how small you are, guys, outline something that's a requirement. What that means is, man, training for the ministry. What are the requirements for service? Like what do you have to do to serve on the security team? Okay. Are there any state requirements in the state that your church is in that tells you before a volunteer can stand there with a pistol, this is the training that you have to have? In most states, that's a carry permit. In Tennessee, it's now a permitless carry state, but we still have carry permits. And as of right now, if you're going to be armed as a volunteer, you got to have one of those carry permits. Okay. One of the two. They haven't changed that yet. Early detection and validation methods. Guys, the way to stop it is come up with something. And Ed talked about this. He's out there engaging with the people. He starts to engage with somebody and it's abnormal. They stop them. And that's exactly what has to happen here. Okay. Responding to the unintentional threats, have the ability to respond to these inadvertent threats. And that's CPR, first aid, whatever, or just making somebody feel better when they slip, trip, and fall on the rug. Go up there, pick them up, tell them you're sorry, see if they can get them a bottle of water, do an incident report if they've actually skinned their knee, so you can tell the church, you can reduce the risk of it. They need to file an insurance claim, whatever. That's your response to the unintentional threats. Arm response. This is a very popular response in security here. Do you have to have arm response to protect the church or the synagogue? No, you need to see people that see these things early, that observe them early, that detect them early, and they can actually respond to them and talk to them and actually deter them and turn those adversaries away during these early phases. Okay, those are your training standards. I won't talk about this because we're over time, guys. Fellowship Bible Church, Mike Phillips is part of the team. I think Brandon's on here. He's my media guy. He's on the team also. This is close to 40 acres. This is our footprint. You can see we use about, and a little bit different now because we got construction going on. In general, we use about 7 people to protect 40 acres of property. And the sanctuary, the learning center, which is children's ministry, which is that big building there in the, you see in the middle. And then there's some administrative offices over there that we protect too. That pond belongs to us also. So this footprint is protected by about 7 or 8 people doing behavior threat detection. It's just overlapping fields of observation using all 3 layers and using some sort of electronic communication, which is what we use. We have a repeater system for our radios just because of the size of the property. So, outside of the marking of the buildings, you can see the Limas and the Whiskeys. These are our positions. Okay. And so this is a full crew, right? This is if we have an abundance. Most of the time we don't have this number, but if we have 7, we can do this with 7 people with this size of the property. Okay. So it doesn't take an army to do it. All right. Last thing, just conflict avoidance. A couple of weeks ago, I was at one second, just answering a response here. Was at a church out in Franklin. I was coming back from fellowship. Usually I'm at fellowship all day. I'll leave about 5 o'clock on Sunday after I finish with everything. And service ends about noon, and then we wrap everything up by about 12:30. Then I'm usually there till about 5 doing work. And I was coming home, and one of our security ministry members lives not too far from me, and we live kind of way out from Brentwood. And so I'm on the way back home, and I had a book for him, and I wasn't able to give it to him because he was actually off that day, and so he didn't volunteer that Sunday. And so I called him, and I'm like, "Hey man, I'm on my way back home." I said, "Won't you meet me somewhere in between our houses, so you don't have to drive all the way to Brentwood because I'm leaving fellowship, so I can give you this book." He's all right, okay. And so we pick out a church that's in Franklin, and years ago I did some training for these folks, and I know the pastor. It's a very popular church in Franklin. It's in a rural part of Franklin. It was Sunday evening, and we were under the assumption there were no services. And so we thought they were over. And so I pull into the church parking lot, and I notice a bunch of cars, And I'm like, oh, they've got a service tonight. I hope they don't mind that I'm going to wait on this guy and give him this book. And so when I pulled up, I noticed a guy standing out in the parking lot with a yellow vest on with cones. He's a parking person, right? He's part of their parking ministry. And so I pull up to him and I'm like, hey, man, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you guys were having a service. I said, hey, I know the pastor here. I'm the security director for Fellowship Bible Church for Franklin and Brentwood. I got a security team member here that lives about 15 minutes from here. He is going to come here in about 10 minutes and meet me. I'm going to give him this book. And the guy was like, man, no problem, brother. You park wherever you want to. You can stay here as long as you want. Till he gets here, you can do whatever you want. I got you. I'm like, all right, I appreciate it. So I back my car in. I start to look around the parking lot and I do a quick pattern analysis. Other people back in just like I did. Other people drive kind of similar cars that I'm driving. There's nothing about me that's against the pattern. And I've already told the parking lot guy who I am and what I'm doing there. Okay. So I text the security team member and I tell him, I'm like, hey, man, there's a church service happening. People are starting to show up for it. Hurry up and get here so I can give you this book when we get out of here. He's like, I'll be there in 5 minutes. So as I'm waiting, I pull my laptop out and I start, I connect to my hotspot and I start answering some emails. And I kind of look up because I'm backed in facing the church in a parking lot, like on the far end of the parking lot. I look up and these two kind of older guys, I say older, they're my age. They step out of the church and they're looking at me. And I can tell it's like their security element. And they're not smiling and they're not greeting. And I'm thinking they're going to come over here. So two things. Number one, they don't know anything about behavior threat detection because I'm not against the pattern. And number two, they don't communicate with their parking team because I've already told them why I'm here. And I am not an anomaly. I am not an anomaly. My car looks very similar to most of the cars in the parking lot, and I'm backed in like every other congregate member is. So that this guy comes walking over, this security lead. I know he's the leader, and he's got a scowl on his face, and he's walking with his arms kind of bowed out like he's going to be tough. And it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. So I roll my window down and he comes up to the window and I look at him and he starts to spill, hello, sir. And I'm like, well, how you doing? And before he could say anything, I said, hey, man, I've already communicated with your parking team. And I said, I've actually 5 years ago, I did some training here. You weren't there, obviously, or you wouldn't be doing this right now. I said, hey, this is who I am. I'm just waiting on somebody. I apologize, but I told your parking guy, I just assumed you guys communicated with each other. Now, he very quickly backed off and apologized, told me I could stay there as long as I wanted to. But that was a negative experience at a church. I had already told somebody why I was there. There was nothing that I was doing was outside the normal of anybody that was parking there. And this is not a small church. Franklin, Tennessee is one of the most affluent areas in Tennessee outside of Brentwood. It's got a large population, and all the evangelical churches in Franklin, the majority of them are large. They have large congregations. And so it's not like it's a tiny church. It's not. It's not a big church, but it's got a big population and has a lot of money. And these people don't know everybody that go to church there. And so, there was nothing that I was doing that was against the pattern. I was not an anomaly. And it gave me a very negative experience. So when we start talking about conflict avoidance, this is what we want to stay away from. There was nothing that I did, anything that I did that should have resulted. If somebody, you want to come up and ask a question, but watch your attitude. And when I start talking about our sinful nature and I start talking about confirmation bias and the way that we look at people, that's exactly the way they looked at me. That's exactly the way. Now, what if I would have been an unbeliever? This is the first time I'd ever been to church. My neighbor, who I knew was a Christian, I see him having cookouts and Bible studies. And I start to ask questions about this. And I decide, he invites me to church, and I decide that Sunday to go to church. And this is the reception that I get. It's going to completely turn me away from the church. And so our physical protection system, or our physical ministry, or our security team cannot conflict with the mission of who we're trying to protect. Now, again, going back to the synagogues, folks, their threat characteristics are a little bit different, and they're going to treat this a little bit differently than we are. Okay. All right. Questions? Well, folks, hey, be glad to help you with this. If you want help, I do everything from behavior threat detection to your medical response training certification. We do active shooter certification, firearms training, security assessments, physical security plans. We're starting to do this CSP, this complete security program package. I just finished the complete package. I did an assessment, or it was a survey, their emergency action plan, their training qualification plan, and their physical security plan. Had that all done within 2 weeks. They now have a standard. They're following that standard, and I'm completing another one for another church that's out of state. So we do everything from all the procedures and processes to creating your standard to providing any kind of training that your security ministry